The saloon fell silent as three young gunslingers surrounded the gray-haired cowboy at the bar. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and the piano player's hands froze mid-chord. The old man didn't even turn around. "You're Jake Lightning Morrison, ain't ya?" sneered the leader, a cocky kid barely 20 with pearl-handled revolvers. "My daddy said you used to be fast." "Used to be." His companions laughed, hands hovering near their holsters. The bartender slowly backed away, knowing what was coming. Jake took a slow sip of his whiskey, his weathered face expressionless. "Your daddy was right about one thing. Boy, I used to show mercy to fools." "We heard you lost your edge," another gunslinger taunted. 3 against 1, old man. "Even a legend can't beat those odds." The old cowboy finally turned, his steel-gray eyes cold as winter frost. 20 years might have passed since his last showdown, but those eyes still held the same deadly promise. His hand rested casually near his worn Colt revolver, the same gun that had never lost a duel. "Tell me something, boys," Jake said quietly. "Any of you ever seen lightning strike?" The tension in the Red Canyon saloon was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every patron had either fled through the back door or pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to stay out of the line of fire. The three young guns stood in a triangle formation around Jake Morrison, blocking any easy escape route. They'd planned this ambush for weeks, studying every story about the legendary gunfighter, convinced that age had dulled his reflexes. The leader, who went by the name Quick Draw Carter, circled slowly to Jake's right. He wore expensive leather boots and a brand-new Stetson that had never seen a hard day's work. His father had been a wealthy rancher who'd spoiled him rotten, and now the boy thought money and confidence could buy him a reputation. He'd already killed 2 men in dubious duels, both drunks who never stood a chance. To Jake's left stood the Martinez brothers, Miguel and Carlos, sons of a Mexican bandito who'd been hanged 5 years prior. They blamed men like Jake for bringing law and order to the West, for making it harder for outlaws to operate freely. Their father had died with a bounty on his head, and they'd sworn revenge against every lawman and gunfighter who'd made the frontier safer. Jake Morrison had seen this scene play out 100 times before. Young men with something to prove, chasing glory through another man's grave. In his prime, he'd been the fastest gun in 5 territories, but that was before the arthritis had started creeping into his joints, before the old bullet wounds ached in cold weather, before he'd buried his wife and decided to hang up his guns forever. Or so he'd thought. "You boys really want to do this?" Jake asked calmly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I came here for a quiet drink, not to add 3 more notches to my belt." Quick Draw Carter laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that betrayed his bravado. "The way I hear it, your belt hasn't seen a new notch in 20 years, old man. Word is you retired because you got scared. Because younger, faster guns were coming up, and you knew your time was done." Jake's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that the words had struck a nerve. The truth was more complicated than fair. He'd retired because he'd grown tired of the killing, tired of seeing young men die for no good reason, tired of the nightmares that came with every life he'd taken. His wife, Sarah, had begged him to stop, and when she got sick, he'd promised that he'd never draw his gun in anger again. He'd kept that promise for 2 decades, settling in this small town, doing odd jobs, keeping to himself. Most folks didn't even know who he was. The legend of Lightning Morrison had faded like an old photograph, and he preferred it that way. But these 3 had done their homework. Someone had talked, probably old Tom the blacksmith, who couldn't keep his mouth shut after a few drinks. Now the secret was out, and every young gun within 100 miles would be coming to test themselves against the faded legend. Miguel Martinez stepped forward, his hand twitching near his revolver. "My papa told me about you before he died. He said you were the one who shot him in Abilene, back in '55. Jake shook his head slowly. "I've never been to Abilene, son, and I never killed a man named Martinez. You've got the wrong cowboy. You're lying." Carlos spat. "All you lawmen are the same. You kill our people and then pretend it never happened." "I'm not a lawman," Jake replied evenly. "Never was. I was just a man trying to survive in a hard land. Same as your father, I reckon." The bartender, pressed flat against the back wall, whispered a prayer. He'd seen gunfights before, messy, chaotic affairs where innocent people sometimes caught stray bullets. He prayed this would be over quickly. Jake could feel his heart beating steady and slow in his chest. The fear that had gripped him in his younger days was long gone, replaced by calm acceptance. If this was his time, so be it. He'd lived longer than most men in his profession. But if these boys forced his hand, he wouldn't go down easy. Quick Draw Carter's confidence was growing with each passing second. The old man hadn't moved, hadn't shown any of the legendary speed the stories promised. Maybe those stories were just tall tales after all. Maybe Jake Morrison really was nothing but a washed-up has-been. Last chance, old man, Carter announced. Draw, or we'll gun you down where you stand like the coward you are. Jake took one final sip of his whiskey, set the glass down gently on the bar, and turned to face all three men. His expression hadn't changed. Calm, almost sad, like a teacher disappointed in his students. I gave you boys a way out, he said quietly. Remember that when this is over. His hand hadn't moved yet, but something in his eyes had shifted. The bartender recognized it immediately. He'd seen that look once before, 30 years ago, in another gunfighter's eyes just before a duel. It was the look of a man who'd already won. The afternoon sun had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the saloon floor. Quick Draw Carter's hand trembled imperceptibly, a detail that Jake's experienced eyes caught immediately. The boy was nervous, despite all his bravado. That made him dangerous. Nervous men pulled triggers too quickly, made mistakes that got people killed. Miguel Martinez was sweating, droplets running down his temple despite the cool interior of the saloon. His brother Carlos kept licking his lips, another telltale sign of fear masquerading as courage. They were scared, all three of them, but their pride had backed them into a corner they couldn't escape from without losing face. Jake had seen it 1,000 times. Young men who'd built their reputations on stories and small-town victories, suddenly facing the reality that real gunfighting wasn't like the dime novels. It wasn't glorious. It was brutal, final, and unforgiving. You know what the problem with you young guns is. Jake said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. You think speed is everything. You practice your draw for hours, timing yourselves, competing to see who can clear leather fastest. He shifted his weight slightly, and all three men tensed, hands hovering over their weapons. But Jake hadn't gone for his gun. He was simply adjusting his stance, settling into a position he'd learned decades ago, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced, body angled to present a smaller target. But speed without accuracy is just noise, Jake continued. And accuracy without strategy is just luck. You want to know what made me Lightning Morrison? It wasn't being the fastest. It was being the smartest. Quick Draw Carter sneered, though his voice cracked slightly. You're just stalling, old man. Trying to talk your way out of your stance is wrong. Jake interrupted, nodding toward Carter. You're standing too square, presenting your whole chest as a target. And you, he looked at Miguel, you're gripping your holster with your left hand. That's a tell. Shows me your right hand and you're planning to draw crossbody. Means you'll be a half-second slower than you think. Carlos's eyes widened. The old man was reading them like a book, pointing out weaknesses they didn't even know they had. It was unsettling, like facing a poker player who could see through marked cards. And you, Jake said, focusing on Carlos, you keep glancing at your brother. You're waiting for him to move first. That means you're not a leader, you're a follower. In a gunfight, followers die first because they are always reacting instead of acting. The bartender watched in amazement. Jake Morrison wasn't just preparing for a gunfight. He was giving these boys a lesson, teaching them even as they threatened his life. It was the strangest thing he'd ever witnessed. Quick Draw Carter's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Enough talk. You're just trying to get in our heads. It's working, isn't it? Jake replied calmly. That's another lesson, boys. A gunfight starts long before anyone draws. It starts in the mind. The man who stays calm, who controls his breathing, who doesn't let emotion cloud his judgment. That's the man who walks away. Jake's right hand hung loose at his side, fingers relaxed, nowhere near his gun. Yet somehow, He seemed more dangerous than all three of them combined. There was a coiled readiness in his posture, a predatory stillness that spoke of countless battles survived. "My wife used to ask me how I always won," Jake said, his voice softer now, touched with memory. "I told her it was because I never wanted to fight. The men who wanted it too badly, who craved the glory and the reputation, they made mistakes. They got overconfident. They died." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "You boys want this too badly. That's why you'll lose. We're 3 against 1. Miguel shouted, his patience finally breaking. "Even if you're as fast as they say, you can't beat all of us." Jake smiled, a sad, knowing smile that chilled the blood of everyone watching. "You're thinking like amateurs. You think you'll all draw at once, fill the air with lead, and sheer numbers will win. But here's what will actually happen." He raised his left hand slowly, pointing at Quick Draw Carter. "You'll die first because you're the loudest, the most aggressive. Your ego won't let you hold back." His fingers shifted to Miguel. "You'll die second because you're already committed. I can see it in your eyes. You've convinced yourself your father needs avenging, and you won't stop until you're dead." Finally, he pointed at Carlos. "And you, boy, you'll die last because you'll hesitate. You'll see your brother fall. You'll see Carter drop, and for just a split second, you'll doubt. You'll wonder if you should run, and that hesitation will kill you." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake had just described their death with the casual certainty of a man reading tomorrow's newspaper. Each of them felt the truth of his words in their bones. "Now," Jake said quietly, "I'm going to count to 3. When I reach 3, you boys can draw, or you can walk out that door and live to see tomorrow. Your choice." His hand still hadn't moved toward his gun. 1, 2. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sweat poured freely down Miguel's face now, and his hand shook visibly above his holster. Carlos had gone pale, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under the scorching sun. Even Quick Draw Carter, for all his bluster and expensive gear, looked like a man staring into his own grave. The bartender held his breath. In all his years running the Red Canyon Saloon, he'd never witnessed anything like this. Jake Morrison hadn't even drawn his weapon, yet he'd already won the psychological battle. The 3 young guns were coming apart at the seams, their confidence shattered by simple observation and cold truth. "Wait!" Carter's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. But something in those steel-gray eyes had reached through his pride and touched the survival instinct buried beneath. "Wait! Just hold on." Jake's expression didn't change. His hand remained relaxed at his side, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, never stopped watching all 3 men simultaneously. It was like he could see in multiple directions at once, processing every twitch, every breath, every micro-movement that might signal an attack. "You got something to say, boy?" Jake asked calmly. "Say it quick. 3 comes after 2. Carter licked his lips, his mind racing. His father had always told him to pick his battles, but he'd been too arrogant to listen. Now, facing a legend who'd just dissected their weaknesses like a doctor examining cadavers, he realized his father had been right about more than just Jake's speed. "How do we know you're really that fast?" Carter asked, grasping for anything that might delay the inevitable. "Maybe you're just bluffing. Maybe you're just a good talker who got lucky back in the day." A slight smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth. "You want proof? Fine." What happened next occurred so fast that most people in the saloon couldn't process it until it was over. Jake's hand moved, not toward his gun, but in a casual gesture toward the shelf behind the bar where 5 whiskey bottles stood in a neat row. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that all 3 young guns instinctively drew their weapons. 6 shots rang out in rapid succession, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Gun smoke filled the air, and when it cleared, the scene before them made no sense at all. All 3 young guns stood frozen, their revolvers pointed forward, smoking barrels aimed at where Jake had been standing. But Jake had moved during the chaos of their draw, a simple sidestep that had taken him 2 feet to the left. Their bullets had smashed into the bar and the wall behind it, splintering wood and sending whiskey bottles crashing to the floor. But Jake's gun was back in its holster, and on the shelf behind the bar, 4 of the 5 whiskey bottles remained standing. The middle bottle, the one that had been directly behind where Jake had originally stood, had a hole drilled perfectly through its center. The bullet had passed through without even making the bottle fall over. The 3 young guns stayed in disbelief. They had drawn first. All 3 of them had cleared leather and fired while Jake had simply moved. He'd drawn, fired a single shot with surgical precision, and reholstered before any of them had finished pulling their triggers. That answer your question? Jake asked quietly. The bartender's jaw hung open. He'd seen Jake draw and fire, but his eyes had barely been able to track the movement. It had been like watching lightning strike. There one instant, gone the next, leaving only thunder and destruction in its wake. Miguel's gun slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound broke the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Carlos lowered his weapon slowly, his face ashen. He'd just seen something that defied belief, something that proved every legend about Lightning Morrison had been an understatement, not an exaggeration. Quick Draw Carter still held his revolver, but his arm had dropped to his side, pointing at the floor. His hand shook so badly that the gun rattled. He'd been practicing his quick draw since he was 12 years old, convinced he was destined for greatness. He'd timed himself at under a second, faster than most men could blink. But Jake Morrison had made him look like a child playing with toys. "You boys are lucky," Jake said, his voice carrying no trace of mockery or pride, just simple statement of fact. 20 years ago, I wouldn't have wasted time talking. I would have put all 3 of you down before you finished surrounding me. Age has made me patient, maybe too patient. He walked slowly toward the saloon doors, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Every eye in the room followed him, but none of the 3 young guns dared move. They'd been given a gift, the gift of seeing their own mortality without having to pay the ultimate price for the lesson. Jake paused at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the afternoon sun. Without turning around, he spoke one final time. "You want to know the real reason I retired? It wasn't because I got slow. It wasn't because I got scared. It was because I got tired of proving myself to boys like you who don't understand that some legends are warnings, not invitations." The saloon remained frozen in stunned silence as Jake Morrison stepped through the doorway and onto the dusty street. The afternoon sun cast his long shadow back into the bar, stretching across the floor like a dark reminder of what had almost happened. Inside, the 3 young guns stood motionless, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Quick Draw Carter was the first to move. He holstered his revolver with shaking hands and stumbled toward the nearest chair, collapsing into it. His expensive hat fell to the floor, forgotten. His whole body trembled as the adrenaline drained away, leaving only the cold realization of how close he'd come to death. "He could have killed us," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible. He bent down to retrieve his fallen revolver, staring at it as if seeing it for the first time. "All 3 of us, before we even knew what happened." Carlos nodded mutely, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't crying from fear alone, but from the weight of understanding. His father's death, which he'd blamed on men like Jake Morrison, suddenly seemed different. If his father had faced someone like Jake, perhaps it hadn't been murder. Perhaps it had been justice, or at least consequence. The bartender finally found his voice. "You boys need to understand something. What you just saw, that wasn't even Jake at his best. That was Jake Morrison at 65 years old, with arthritis in his hands and 20 years of rust on his skills. Can you imagine what he was like in his prime?" The patrons who'd witnessed the confrontation began emerging from their hiding places, talking in hushed, reverent tones. Word would spread through town by sundown, and by tomorrow, the legend of Lightning Morrison would be reborn, not because he'd killed 3 men, but because he'd shown mercy while proving he could have. Outside, Jake walked slowly down the main street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. His hands were steadier than they'd been in years, muscle memory awakening from its long sleep. Part of him felt alive in a way he hadn't in 2 decades. But a larger part felt a deep sadness. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he muttered to himself, thinking of his late wife. "I tried to keep my promise. I really did." He'd kept his word for 20 years. He hadn't drawn his gun in anger, hadn't taken a life. But today, he'd been forced to show these boys the truth, that some men couldn't be reasoned with through words alone. They needed to see death's door before they believe it existed. An old woman sweeping her porch called out to him. "That drew what they are saying, Mr. Morrison? You really outdrew 3 men without breaking a sweat." Jake tipped his hat to her politely. "Just had a conversation with some misguided young men, Mrs. Henderson. Nothing more." But she'd seen the look in his eyes, the same look her husband had carried after returning from the war. The look of a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and carried the weight of it all. As Jake reached the edge of town, he paused and looked back. The Red Canyon Saloon stood in the center of the street, smoke still drifting from its windows. Beyond it, the small town he'd called home for 20 years stretched out peacefully. He'd come here to escape his past, to become someone other than Lightning Morrison. But the past, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. Inside the saloon, Quick-Draw Carter stood up on unsteady legs. His 2 companions looked at him, waiting for him to say something, to make sense of what had happened. He was supposed to be their leader, after all. "We were fools," Carter said quietly. "We came here hunting a legend, thinking we could build our reputations on an old man's grave. But legends become legends for a reason." Miguel picked up his hat from the floor, turning it over in his hands. "My father, he wasn't killed by a man like Morrison. He couldn't have been. Papa was fast, but not like that. Nobody's that fast." "Morrison is," the bartender said, pouring himself a stiff drink with shaking hands. "Always was. Always will be. Some men are just born different. Born with reflexes that defy nature, with instincts that can't be taught. Your papa probably died to some lucky coward who shot him in the back. That's usually how real outlaws die." Carlos wiped his eyes and looked at his brother. "We should go home." "Yeah," Miguel agreed. "We should go home and tell Mama that Papa's death wasn't worth dying for ourselves." Quick-Draw Carter walked slowly to the door and looked out at the street where Jake had disappeared. "I'm going to tell this story for the rest of my life. About the day I faced Lightning Morrison and lived because he chose mercy over glory." He turned back to the Martinez brothers. "And every time I tell it, I'm going to remember that real gunfighters don't go looking for fights. Real gunfighters are the ones who walk away when they can, and only fight when they must." The 3 young men left the saloon together, their weapons holstered, their pride shattered but their lives intact. They'd come to Red Canyon seeking to kill a legend. Instead, they'd learned the most important lesson of their lives, that survival sometimes means knowing when you're beaten before the first shot is fired. As they mounted their horses and rode out of town, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Behind them, the legend of Lightning Morrison grew a little larger, not from the bodies he'd left behind, but from the lives he'd spared. And somewhere on the edge of town, an old cowboy sat on a rock, watching the sunset and talking quietly to his long-dead wife. They were just boys, Sarah. Stupid, arrogant boys. But they were somebody's sons. I just couldn't. The wind picked up, rustling through the sagebrush, and for just a moment, Jake could swear he heard Sarah's voice on the breeze, telling him she was proud, that mercy was a greater strength than any fast draw could ever be. Jake Morrison stood, dusted off his pants, and walked toward his small cabin on the hill. His gun hung heavy at his side, a reminder that some skills never fade, some instincts never die, and some legends are earned not through violence, but through the wisdom to know when violence isn't the answer. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Lightning Morrison disappeared into the gathering darkness, a ghost from another era who'd proven that even in old age, even with rust on his skills, he was still faster than death itself. But more importantly, he'd proven that being fast enough to kill and being wise enough not to were 2 very different things, and the latter was the mark of a true legend. The story of the day Lightning Morrison outdrew 3 men without killing them spread across the West like wildfire. Some said he'd lost his edge and gotten lucky. Others said it proved he was even more dangerous than the legends claimed. But those 3 young men who'd faced him knew the truth. They'd looked into the eyes of death and been given a second chance. And sometimes, that second chance is worth more than all the glory in the world. If you enjoyed this tale of the Old West, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more legendary stories of gunfighters, outlaws, and the untamed frontier. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us which legendary gunslinger you'd like to hear about next. Was it Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp? Let us know below. Face with cowboy hat, medium white star. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling Western story. Thanks for watching, partners.